Welcome to another video. Tonight we have 9 stories, from stories of odd jobs, wells, creepy websites, and more. If you have a story of your own, it can be sent to reddit.com/r/slumberreads. These videos do take me quite a bit of time to create, so if you're feeling generous, and if you feel this video is worth one, please be sure to drop a like rating. It helps the channel more than most think. Subscribing if you're new is also greatly appreciated. Enjoy the video, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. Arrowhead Lake, the ideal and picturesque image of an all-American, man-made lake. It's vast, its water's fresh, yet rarely cold and brimming with fish. Like the other big man-made lakes, such as Norman, Harrington, or Thunderbird, Arrowhead had developed somewhat of a colorful cultural superstition. Everything from man-eating leeches, with underbellies covered in fangs, capable of toppling over canoes, to catfish who grew to enormous size, due radiation leaking out from the nearby plant. Then there's the ghosts. The bargain bin, Bigfoot ripoff, and the occasional flying saucer. But none of those things have ever held any place in my mind. Being your typical, conservative-raised, athletic type who loved fishing on the lake, I was immune to the fears and warnings from the locals. I'd scoff whenever I'd hear old Mrs. Cutler telling people how her dog was snatched from the shoreline by Black, the giant man-eating leech with an underbelly covered in teeth. Furthermore, I made it my mission to humiliate and ridicule my peers who had a tale about a cousin who was eaten or drowned by something under the surface. In other words, I was a bit of an ass. In my defense, I had never seen anything to suggest my version of the world was wrong. I had lived on the lake, went fishing with my grandpa throughout my childhood, before his boating accident, and I had become convinced that there wasn't anything to be afraid of. I was wrong. There is something in that lake. In truth, it's the reason I'm writing this up. Partly to see if anyone else encountered what I saw. Partly to warn people to stay away, and also partly as a form of therapy. To help me come to terms with what I experienced. Firstly, we need some context for my encounter. And I think it all began after high school. You see, growing up on that lake, there were a few jobs for those of us who dived out of school with barely any idea of what to do next. It was either work in the power plant or work on the lake. So I combined the two and made it my mission to get some more grades and more training under my belt, and then it came back to work as an underwater engineer. I was excited at the thought of fixing the dam and repairing the plant's coolant tunnels, where the lake's water was pulled in and used to keep the reactors safe. Mostly I was just curious to see what actually was down there, below the still surface of Arrowhead. The first person I told was my grandpa, but uncharacteristically, he was far from enthusiastic and made a point of telling me in a tone I had never known he possessed to stay out of the lake. Naturally, I laughed it off, telling him I was shocked he believed Mrs. Cutler's old fish wife tales of man-eating leeches and child-drowning catfish. He rolled his sleeves and began to show me various scars from the fish he encountered on the lake and elsewhere. But one set he never spoke of, a peculiar arrangement of deep cuts running up his arm. I asked him how he got them, and his face went pale. He told me that unlike the others, these wounds weren't from catfish, gars, alligators, or eels, but rather from his boating accident. Never before had he discussed what actually happened that day out on the lake, and he still refused to tell me much. Instead, he diverted the conversation back to the lake's folklorist tales. He told me of the Arrowhead 3, a group of divers in the 80s who went down to fix something on the dam and never came back. It was a story I was familiar with. 5 went down, only 2 of them came back up, and the other 3 vanished without a trace. They were ruled as accidental drownings caused by malfunctioning equipment. They didn't find their bodies though, and so they, too, became part of the local lake lore of Arrowhead. My response to this was to do a childish, ooh, scary, something my grandfather didn't take kindly to. He snapped at me and exclaimed that he knew the lads who survived. One of them was found swinging, the other drank himself to death. Grandpa asserted that one night when he was sat in the company of the old man drowning his liver in beer and whiskey chasers, the man told him what he remembered. He spoke of dark serpents, things emerging out of thin air and snatching them one by one, dragging them into the unknown. When I laughed this off and said aloud I didn't expect my grandpa, a weather-beaten old fisherman and ex-naval officer, to be so superstitious, his face became a scowl and his gruff voice spoke to me. "Them's bad waters. I've seen things I wish I hadn't. Things that would strike you dead off right. You youngins, think you know the world, think you've seen it from behind your screens, but you haven't. Stay out of them waters, and especially keep away from that plant," Grandpa commanded. Sadly, that was one of the last things I remember of him. As whilst I went out of state for training, he passed away. Still, I thought the best way to honor him and his memory would be to totally disregard his warnings and worries, and get to work on the lake as soon as I was qualified. So once the training was completed, I returned home, got a job with the power plant as an engineer, and since I was one of the handful of people qualified for underwater repair jobs, I became somewhat invaluable. I mean, the jobs weren't flying in, and in some ways that was reassuring. I mean, no one wants to be working at a power plant that regularly has power failures or structural damage. However, I couldn't help feeling I had wasted some of my time training for underwater repair, when most of the time I was just sorting out maintenance and basic repairs around the plant. Perhaps some sadistic god out there sensed my disappointment in not being given a chance to dive, because out of the blue, one of the higher-ups approached me and asked if I'd be willing to help sort out a problem. According to him, one of the 2 cooling tunnels had stopped working properly. The consensus was that there may have been damage to the tunnel, and it had partially collapsed, but the higher-ups wanted to assess the damage first, and then it was a simple unclogging or a relatively straightforward repair. We'd get to fixing it. So, me and another guy suited up for a dive. Eddie, the guy joining me, was a sweet guy, always eagerly trying to reassure me, since this was my first proper dive. On a little motorized raft, we made our way to the area just above the underwater tunnels. There we disembarked and slipped off from the security of a small raft and sank into the water. Being that he was a bit older than me, he made a point, prior to us entering the water, of saying to just stick with him. He told me that it gets quite murky down there, and add in the fact it was nighttime, and it was a recipe for your mind to play tricks. He wasn't wrong either, because I remember feeling an overwhelming dread after only a few minutes into the dive. The kind of dread one feels when you feel like you're being watched, or when you're alone in the house and think you hear someone. Irrational dread. That's what I told myself. Just my body reacting to the fact I could barely see anything in front of my face. So on I swam, trying my best to ignore the anxiety rising in me and focus on the task at hand. Soon though, my mind was back to observing my surroundings in an over-vigilant manner. I remember the water getting warmer, the deeper we swam, and it got more and more cloudy as we descended. Though it was dark and murky, my torch occasionally caught glimpses of catfish that were large enough to make me feel even more uncomfortable, but I tried to keep my nerve. Plenty of food, warmth, and depth. What fish wouldn't thrive in such conditions? I told myself. Besides, I never saw a catfish that I could honestly say was capable of man-eating or drowning me, and that was somewhat reassuring. Then suddenly they scattered. All of them. The big ones and the small, thrashing their way past me and Eddie, as they shot out from their hiding places. That should have been the only warning we needed, but we foolishly thought we had disturbed them. How were we to know that we were about to come face to face with the truth? We were at the cooling tunnels when things took a turn. Eddie went about looking at the one on the right, shining torch into it, whilst I inspected the left. My one appeared to be working fine, sucking in water, churning it up into the power plant basin, where presumably it spat it back out on the other side. In the short time it took for me to inspect the tunnel, something happened. Having looked away for just a moment, I was shocked when I turned to find Eddie had vanished. Frantically, I spun my head around, but there was no sign of him. Not a trace of Eddie existed in the gloom. If it had been a joke, or he was messing with me, I would have at least expected him to have seen some debris kicked up from his frantic swimming as he dived out of my line of sight. And yet there was nothing. I paused for a time, waiting for him to suddenly jump out of the opaque surroundings and scare the life out of me. That would have been a welcome to terror, but fate was not kind and Eddie did not reappear or reveal himself. Truthfully, my heart began pounding a little faster. The minute I saw he was gone, for in the isolation all I could think of was my grandpa's words. "Them be bad waters." They repeated and repeated, thundering through my head, almost as fast as my heart thundered in my chest. It was in those moments of fear I spotted it, the faint yellow glow shining below and drifting deeper and deeper. Eddie. It was his torch I could see in the mist below. He must have been playing a prank on me after all. Or maybe he dropped his welding tool. Relief washed over me and I swam down to meet him, but as I kicked frantically, my eyes began to see more clearly. The light ahead of me was his torch. That much was true. But Eddie wasn't holding it. Instead, it was just sinking down to the depths of the lake, adrift and abandoned, not unlike myself. Concerned for my colleague's safety, I ran back up to the tunnels. I started worrying that maybe he was clearing out the debris in the blocked tunnel, and somehow it turned on and he got sucked in. I turned my torch on the tunnel entrance. It was wide enough to fit a truck through it, and its gaping maw was dark and empty. Strange, because there didn't seem to be any structural damage. No sign of a blockage at all. It was just a void. A black void. So dark that even my torch's light couldn't penetrate it. Primal dread filled me as I looked into the silent and still shadows filling the opening. My courage and confidence were devoured by the darkness. It was all consuming. I felt more lost than I had ever felt before, as I floated in front of that coolant tunnel, staring into the abyss, hoping to see Eddie emerge from the void unharmed. Only it wasn't a void at all, and it was far from empty, for as my torch shined across the night-colored surface, it shimmered, stirred, squirmed even. Then to my utter disbelief, an eye blinked open, an eye the size of a car tire. Fear struck me and sent me scrambling back for a second, and between the mist of panicked bubbles streaming up around my goggles, I saw the enormous thing slowly shifting in the tunnel. Great, thick, black-backed tentacles unfolded around a large, phosphorus eye, with each limb displaying red rings of light that pulsed and moved across the dark skin of the beast, growing ever quicker in the motion as the glowing blue eyes focused its horizontal slit-shaped pupil on me. And as it saw me, I saw it too. Saw the thing for what it was, and though my mind could not process the reality, I was sure of it. The thing in the tunnel, the blockage, was an enormous cephalopod, a giant octopus, a kraken of monstrous dimensions. A creature clever enough to conceal itself as the shadow inside a tunnel and evade the sights of a bustling lakeside community. It was evident from this and from its appearance that the creature was far from ordinary. Beneath each black tendril, running under it, were fangs and toothy hooks, which retracted and extended in and out of red flesh. These appendages clasped the exterior and the rim of the tunnel, slithering outwards in a serpentine manner. I froze in place and my mind raced back to the wounds upon my grandfather's arms, the strange tooth patterns running up sleeves. They could have been caused by such an appendage. Then worse still, I came to understand those fish wive tails of Blackback the Leech with its underbelly of fangs. The stories I had dismissed in my arrogance were true. Only it wasn't a man-eating leech. It was a tentacle, one of many tentacles that were about to reach out and snatch me as they had done the Arrowhead 3. I knew it was about to happen and swam for my life, rushing to the surface as hard as I could. I looked back down to see if the thing was giving chase or following, but it wasn't. There was nothing beneath me or around me, just total absence. My mind immediately realized it was still there, hidden, camouflaged, and around the time it took for me to realize that, it was too late. A toothy tentacle emerged from the gloom, shifting from the grimy, green, murky color of the water around me as it grasped hold of my back. I fumbled and wrestled, desperately trying to wiggle free, but it was no use, as more and more tentacles reached around me and their hooks piercing my suit and skin. I screamed and cried out, but beneath the water, my voice was silenced. Then it pulled me in close, towards what can only be described as a pit of tusks and gnashing jaws stuffed with broken fangs. It was like the mouth of hell, an inescapable grinder, acting on total impulse and instinct, just desperate to crush, skewer, and maul me into shreds. Before it could devour me, like I presumed it had devoured Eddie, I remembered. I was far from unarmed, and in a frantic motion I scrambled for my wielding tool and turned it on. White and blue punctured and burned into one of the tentacles holding me, and instantly it untangled away from me. Like a torpedoed, it shot back, recoiling into opaque walls around me, disappearing once more as its chromatorphs shifted and made it invisible to my eyes. I knew it was still there, and so without a moment of hesitation I began swimming for the surface, sure that the nightmarish amorphous thing was right behind my every kick. Desperate to survive, I unclipped my harness and let the oxygen tank sink below me, trying to remove as much weight from me as I possibly could. And the moment I let it go, I saw it. A vast black, writhing nest of tooth-covered appendages grasped hold of the tank and dragged into the depths below. With one final surge of adrenaline, I thrashed my way back to the surface and onto the boat. Let me tell you, it didn't make me feel any safer from being on that tiny raft, knowing that beneath me, there was a monster-sized octopus more than capable of dragging me and the boat down to its sunken nether realm. And even after speeding the boat onto the shoreline, I couldn't expel the imagined images of that thing clambering ashore to get me. I told the higher-ups what I saw and explained what I believed had happened to Eddie, but as you can imagine, no one believed me. Eddie became just another tragic event on the lake. An oxygen tank malfunctioned, which killed him. A conclusion that the authorities reached without an autopsy or even a body. The wounding I had suffered, nothing more than self-inflicted according to the power plant's first aider, a side effect of nitrogen narcosis. I quit and stopped going out fishing in my spare time, but I continued to warn people, to tell them of what I saw on the lake. Just as I had been skeptical of the tales of Blackback, the man-eating leech, now others were skeptical of my tale of an old, one-sized octopus. Living in the coolant tunnels of the power plant, I've had experts and Facebook critics alike telling me how there are no freshwater octopuses, that it's impossible for them to get to the size I described. And to them I have this to say. As my grandpa told me, Lake Arrowhead is bad water, and should they dive beneath its surface, with the same skepticism as I had, they will be met with the truth. There is something in that lake. I don't know how or why, or what it is exactly, but it is there. And it is hungry. Have you ever had an incident in your life that made you question everything you knew, or thought you knew, about the world we live in? If you have, then you might understand what I've been through. This past weekend, I was visiting my cousin Cole in his small town in the middle of nowhere. It was a 2-hour drive from my city. Earlier this year, he had married a small town girl and settled down in their rural community. It had been a surprise for all of us. Cole grew up with his malls and multiplexes, subways and skylines, just as I did for that matter. Still, I've always liked my cousin. I didn't make it to their wedding, so I was making peace with a weekend trip to their place. Their house was right on the outskirts of their town. Cole greeted me with a familiar smile, joking about my bulging waistline, while I gave him a hard time about his receding hairline. He showed me the guest bedroom, and it was more than ample space for the 2 nights I'd be spending there. That's the good thing about these rural towns. Square footage is cheap as dirt. I noticed some strange ornaments on a bookshelf in the room. They appeared handmade and reminded me of those little trinkets you see in New Age stores. When I asked Cole about it, he just shrugged and mumbled something about his wife and told me to wash up for dinner. I soon got the impression that his wife Ashley liked to keep to herself. She served dinner and didn't say much else to me the whole evening. Cole gave her space and didn't seem to push things with her either. Around her, he seemed less jovial. Men change after marriage, I suppose. Not that I cared. After dinner, Cole and I had a fire outside and had drinks and joked about, like, old times again. I kept expecting him to open up to me about his wife or tell me more about his little town, but he never did. All he would do is talk about our old adventures together. It was as if he had nothing to tell me about these past few months. Something felt wrong. Every hour, Cole would get up and go into the house. He was chugging one beer after another, and so I assumed he needed to pee. But I finally got curious and walked up to the house and looked inside. Cole and Ashley were sitting at the dinner table, which had been cleared save for one lit candle. They were holding hands and muttering something. I got the impression that it was some sort of a prayer or ritual. He seemed to be following her lead. I don't know if he saw me looking or not. Cole came back to the fire and never brought it up. When I cautiously hinted at it, he gave me a blank look and pretended he didn't know what I was talking about. Over the course of the weekend, there were other incidents. There were various rules and rituals which I could tell they were following, but for the most part they left me alone. They did ask me not to leave the house after midnight, and if we ate outside to never leave any food by the fire, and to make sure that I cleaned that up completely. I also heard them say something about taking me out to a well, but since I didn't see one on their property, I never asked them about it. By the end of the weekend, I was fed up by the silent treatment from Ashley, and by Cole clearly being on edge at times but not saying anything. It was a long weekend and I had meant to stay another night, but I decided I'd had enough. Despite Ashley's protests, I told him that I would be leaving that evening. She had suddenly turned into a keen host and nearly pressured me into staying the night until I lied to her and told her that my work wanted me to come in early the next day. I wasn't unhappy when I finally left on Sunday evening, waving bye to them in my rearview mirror. The way back took a different route. It was getting quite dark, and I wished I had left earlier, but eventually the slow moonlit drive was not so stressful. I was on a dirt road in the desert with little else around me for miles, save for some bushes here and there. It was almost peaceful. I soon saw something to the left of the road. At first, I thought it was a tiny little shed, but as I got closer, I saw that it was a well. I slowed the car to a halt, and then lingered. I was alone on the road. Was this the well they had mentioned? Unlikely. I was already 20 or 30 minutes away from the house. Why would they come out here? I saw a tiny little sign in the dirt next to the well. There was just enough light to see the word private scrawled across it. I left my car and walked past the sign. Not that I'm a troublemaker, but just the whispers about a well I had heard over the weekend and now this. I figured I would go have a look. Maybe see how deep it is. See if there's actually any water down there. Well, it was a stone well, wider across than I was tall. It had a dilapidated roof over it, and the thin piece quietly rattled in the windy night. There was some other items scattered around the well that looked like tools. I went right up to the well and took a look down below. Nothing. It was pitch black. I couldn't even tell how deep it was. I looked around for a pebble, found one, and dropped it down. It took at least 2 or 3 seconds before I heard it clatter at the bottom of the well. No water. It was then that I felt I was being watched. I wonder if my eyes had adjusted to the moonlight by then, because I saw more of the area around the well. There were dirty, greasy buckets that I hadn't noticed before. There was also suddenly a strong stench that came up from the depths of the well, and, to my surprise, there were even little steps carved in within the inside of the well wall, almost as a makeshift ladder leading down. I felt an urge to climb down. I don't know how much time passed, but with each minute I felt more and more that I needed to climb down there. I resisted the urge. That's when I heard my cousin's voice from down in the well. "Hello?" A shaky voice called out. Is someone up there?" I didn't answer. Impossible. And yet it was unmistakably his voice. "Please help. I've been here for so long. For months. It's..." I remember the anguish, the pain in that voice to this day. Cole's voice was abruptly cut off, and for a second there was silence. What I heard after that was a blood-curdling scream of pure terror. The scream echoed across the desert and then faded. I hadn't moved. I kept listening. I could swear I heard something else now, and it was getting louder. It was a shuffling sound. I kept listening, and, sure enough, it sounded like something was coming up the well, and fast. I don't remember all the details of what happened next. I must have made a mad dash to the car. I remember starting the car and putting it into drive. That's when it came out of the well. It had dragged up some sort of a large bed sheet with it, so it was hard to get a good look. It was tall and oddly proportioned. It moved in an unnerving way, almost as if it had joints and limbs where you would not expect it to. It turned its head towards the car, towards me. What I saw next I will never forget. Underneath the bed sheet I could see Cole's twisted face. His eyes locked with mine and he screamed again. I drove off. It still took several minutes of driving in the desert before the screams stopped. Minutes became hours, and I had never been more relieved to see the city lights as I approached the city. When I got home, I stayed in the car for a few minutes. My head was spinning and I felt exhausted. Then I noticed that I had a new text message from Cole. "What the hell did you do?" "You awake yet, son?" I rubbed my eyes, turning my head towards the doorway to see my dad standing in the doorway in his usual blue overalls and white shirt. "Well, I guess I am now." I replied in a groggy and tired voice. "Not late for school, am I?" Without saying a word, he gestured for me to follow him before turning around and heading back down the stairs. Quickly I got out of bed, knowing from his blank facial expression that my dad was clearly upset. I picked up the pace in an attempt to catch up with my father, who was already out the door. Now at my father's side, I slowed down my pace to take in the beautiful sunny morning as we walked to the pig pen. When we got to the entrance to the pen, my father stopped walking. I followed suit. He got down on one knee right next to me as to be at my height level and pointed inside the pen. "Anything seem odd to you?" I was about to reply no when I noticed what he was referring to. There were only 4 pigs inside the pen, when there were usually 5. My heart sank when I remembered that I was the one who closed the pen last night. My father turned his head towards me. "Look at me, boy." Slowly I turned to face him, worried that I would be punished for my mistake. "Did you let one of the pigs get out?" No. I started to reply. I'd never make such a mistake. My father continued to stare intently at me with his doubtful eyes, making me more and more nervous each second he held his glance. Finally, he pushed himself up and looked up at the sky and then back down at me. We'll talk about this later. You got school to go to. I breathed a sigh of relief as he walked by me and back into the house. I'd have some hours of school before whatever punishment awaited me. Before walking back into the house, I turned to the pen in front of me and began to wonder how one of the pigs managed to get out. I could have sworn I locked the gate tight. Oh well, didn't matter. I went back inside the old wooden house and headed straight for the kitchen. There, my mom was making breakfast in her favorite red apron. She turned her head to me and smiled. "I heard you let one of the pigs out," she said in her deep southern accent. "Yeah?" I responded in a disappointed tone. Don't know how I managed to even... My mother raised her hand as a gesture to stop speaking, which I followed. "It's okay," she started. "I know it was an accident. Your father knows that too. He's just a bit cranky for now, that's all." Having been reassured by her, I smiled and thanked my mom. "No problem," she replied in her usual upbeat and happy tone. "Now come on, I made you breakfast." Finishing my breakfast, I changed out of my pajamas I had worn the night before into more presentable attire. After getting all ready, I sat on my bed and started shifting through my backpack in order to make sure I had everything. Homework, folders. Oh yeah, I almost forgot. I got up and went over to my dresser and opened the bottom drawer. I pushed away some clothes to the bottom of the dresser, where it sat. Pepper spray. I picked up the pepper spray and stuffed it in my back pocket. There were some rowdy teenagers that liked to scare kids like me while we walked to and from school. I managed to get my hands on some pepper spray without either of my parents knowing, just in case the teenagers ever get even more violent. After ensuring that I was all set, I made my way downstairs. "Bye, honey. Have a good day at school," my mom said as I walked out the door. "Thanks, Mom. I'll try." As I closed the door behind me, I walked down the old wooden steps to our porch, each making a creak as I stepped on it. I was about to make my way down the road when I stopped due to a question that had just popped in my head. Would pepper spray really be enough to stop them? I asked myself aloud. Sure, I'd be able to stun one of them for a good second, but that would just make them angrier. As I questioned the power of my pepper spray, a new idea popped into my head. Feeling a small smirk come across my face, I turned over to the large cornfield in front of our house. I could easily walk through the corn to hide from any miscreants looking to cause me harm. I thought it was quite clever of me to think of such an idea. I made up my mind. I was going to walk through the field to get to school. Sure, I wouldn't be able to walk the entire way to school through the corn, but I'd surely be able to walk a good distance in it, given its large size. I strode into the deep cornfield, pushing away any stalk that stood in my way. After walking for about a minute, I began to find the walk rather calming. It was just me, my own thoughts, and the endless sea of corn. I stopped for a moment to fully bask in the relaxing isolation. I took a deep breath as I stared up at the bright blue sky. Breathe in, breathe out. Breathe in, breathe out. Breathe in, crunch. My slow breathing stopped. My eyes widened. Did I really just hear something, or was my mind playing tricks on me? I heard it again. Crunch. No, my mind was not playing tricks on me. There was something else in here. I was horrified. What could possibly be out in here with me? Could it be the bullies? Could it be a wild animal? Could it be the pig? Wait, the pig. The thought of the pig being the source of the sound filled me not with dread, but with hope. Hope that I could redeem myself to my father and avoid punishment. I wasn't foolish, though. I knew that it was entirely possible that whatever this thing was, it could be dangerous. and so I cautiously tiptoed over there with my pepper spray in my right hand just in case. As I got closer to the sound, it became clear that it was eating something, possibly the corn. I soon got even closer and began to hear the swarming of flies. I pushed away the corn stalks as I began to pick up the pace, sure that I was going to find the lost peg. A large smile formed across my face as I pushed away the last of the corn that blocked my vision. My smile quickly faded. At my feet was the pig, its stomach torn open and its innards spilt out. The flies swarmed over the carcass, eager to lay their eggs in its wounds. The only thing worse than the fate of the hog was what was kneeling over it, eating what remained. A humanoid figure with brown, leathery skin was chewing at the meat left on the pig's bones, causing a crunching sound. I let out a loud gasp, which caused this abomination to look up at me with its deformed face and black sunken eyes. The monstrosity stopped its feast to lunge at me. Thankfully, I was quick enough to spray it in the eyes, making it let out a screech of pain and stop mid-lunge. I used this to my advantage and began to run from it as far as I could. I heard that thing start to run behind me, somehow being able to catch up with me. I could hear its raspy grunts as it slowly came closer, soon sounding like it was right next to me. It swiped, pulling my backpack off instead of clawing me. Afterwards, it soon lost interest in me and stopped its hunt as soon as I got out of the cornfield. I leapt onto the hard concrete road, finally away from the beast. I tried to get back up, but my body had used all of its energy to get me out of the cornfield that it had no more to keep running. I rolled over onto my back, my chest pounding and my lungs racing. I slowly poked my head up to look back into the field. Nothing. There was nothing but the endless sea of corn. Has anyone came across a strange stock photo site? Pretty basic and generic looking at first, but with a, shall we say, sinister collection. I suppose I should be more descriptive and provide more information, but I also need to be careful not to provide too much. What I mean by that is I genuinely don't believe anyone who hasn't already come across this site before should come across it. Like, at all. Ever. Nope. Obviously this means don't expect a URL from me. And before someone asks, this is not from some horrific corner of the dark web or anything. It's easily accessible, and I originally found it from a normal Google search when looking for images depicting a very specific situation. Also, I won't risk elaborating in case a foolhardy reader with more curiosity than sense used it to search for the site, so don't ask. Interestingly, the exact search I used no longer brings results for the weird site anymore, though I know it's still there. As for how, I'll get to that. Anyway, when I first visited this website in question, there was not much to immediately separate it from normal stock photo websites. The layout is pretty generic, even basic, but there were more results for what I was looking for than from anywhere else I'd come across so far. So at first I thought I'd hit the jackpot. A few of the photos had aspects making them seem a little off, such as odd expressions on people's faces, weirdly off-center shots, people in photos not looking at what they clearly should be looking at, etc. But I figured this was maybe just a matter of a quantity over quality kind of business model. A site including even clearly subpar options and all. After all, there were a lot of results to choose from, even for my niche requirements. And again, I'd had no luck finding any strong matches from other sites and searches. And believe me, I tried for a while. Also, most of the first images I browsed through were innocuous, so I picked a decent couple of photos and moved on. I also had need for depictions of several simpler, more common situations for my project, and I figured I might as well just get all the images I needed from the same site. This turned out to be a mistake I quickly regretted. At first, it really was just a few photos that seemed kind of off. in ways I mostly brushed off to myself as results of shoddy photography or setup. For example, a child in a very lightly furnished hospital room, reading a book that appears blank from the page he's turning. Prop book, I guessed. A couple having a picnic in the park as a dark and blurry form loomed behind them. Random camera or photo development distortion, I told myself. Or an office scene with scattered bones and two people chatting next to a water cooler filled with dark red, suspiciously blood-like liquid. Maybe it's supposed to be from right after a Halloween party. Honestly, some of them even reminded me of those "what's wrong with the picture" puzzles from when I was a kid. And I even kind of made a game out of it looking for the weird little details. However, the results just seemed to get progressively more disturbing and less subtle the longer I searched. Here's a sample of some of the twisted gems I remember encountering by the time I was about 15 to 20 minutes in. Small children playing hopscotch on the edge of a cliff, one that cut off most of the final space. A realtor discussing a house in the yard with apparently prospective buyers, but with bodies visibly hanging inside next to every window. A department store with a disturbingly large population of mannequins, in positions of shoppers such as walking around the store with carts or holding up clothes as if to examine them with non-existent eyes. All well, actual people, or at least very convincingly human-like figures, stood where you normally see mannequins with expressions of barely concealed terror plastered on their face. The grocery store's checkout, but with the only items being bought and bagged being dripping, unwrapped, and unpackaged hunks of raw meat and viscera. A group of preteens playing cards and laughing, looking like they are enjoying a game of Texas Hold'em, but with what appears to be not playing cards but tarot with demonically styled illustrations. A limbless corpse vertically sliced into long, 3 to 4 inch thick sections that had been stacked back together in the wrong order. A dentist holding a large drill next to a very alarmed-looking patient without any teeth and a mouth held open and almost impossibly wide by some weird clamps, wrapping back around behind a blood-speckled headrest. An adorable green-eyed child, looking to be around 7 or 8 if I had to guess, was smiling at the camera as he stood in front of a mirror, as his scowling reflection somehow was also facing impossibly towards the camera, staring ominously forward with a facial expression of deep hatred and malice, at either photographer or the back of the child. It was hard to tell for sure since the reflection kid's eyes were completely black. I'll be honest, in retrospect, I still perused the site longer than I should have, but it was like watching a car crash that you can't tear your eyes from. In fact, there was actually a GIF for exactly that form when I searched "running into a friend." 2 cars meeting in an almost completely head-on collision on what appeared to be an otherwise empty highway, with a car door opening as far as it still could shortly after, only for the mangled form of a burnt and broken woman. I think, honestly, it was hard to tell for sure from their condition to try and worm their way out. The person stumbled almost all the way out, but then stopped moving entirely for a second or two before the GIF reset. The most alarming to me, though, was definitely one that actually appeared downright pleasant at first, at least in comparison to some of the site's other bizarre offerings. Unlike most other pics so far, it appeared with a vague title or description, "No match." This was odd since it depicted a woman in a beautiful summery dress smoking a clearly successfully lit cigar. Outside on her apartment balcony next to a small boombox and a glass of red wine, looking past the apartment building next door onto the gorgeous sunset just as the sun was halfway down the horizon. I found it a genuinely and refreshingly nice photograph, for about 5 seconds at least. That's when my little Find the Ever game I'd been playing with myself earlier took a truly dark twist, as I noticed multiple little very wrong seeming details almost simultaneously. First, the boombox appeared to have some weird, mold-like fuzz growing on the speaker areas as if to enjoy a nutritious meal of plastic. There was also a withered and drooping potted flower on the ground, but the roots seemed to have grown out of and back over the edge of the pot, crawling back down the walls, all the while getting bigger and gnarlier as they snaked down past the bottom, off the edge of the balcony and out of view. On second glance, the odd pattern of circles on the woman's dress strongly resembles screaming faces. The sun was setting in the wrong direction. That might seem like a weird bit to pick out, but I knew that because of the last detail. I was in the photo. The apartment building I mentioned that the subject was looking past, it was my apartment building, and the apartment directly across from hers was my apartment, with me visible through my own balcony windows, sitting and staring at my PC wearing the exact same outfit that I just happened to be wearing that day. I immediately gasped and got up, then quickly glanced out the window to my balcony, the same one from where I myself like to go out after a long day and watch the sun set, on the other side of the sky, mind you, directly across from my apartment. The building I saw was the same it always had been, a generic office building, void of any balconies. I summoned up every last bit of my courage and glanced back at my computer to look at the image more closely. It hadn't changed, but I now noticed the odd little shadows spattered across my apartment with no discernible matching object that could cast them, and the weird red glow from the window of the otherwise totally dark apartment next door. Also, and I double-checked to confirm this fact later, but I was pretty sure no one currently lived in that one. After seeing that, oh fuck all this. Part of my brain finally won out against the morbid curiosity part, and I tried to close the browser. But nothing happened when I clicked on the X, or when I then tried to stop Chrome via Task Manager. I even restarted my laptop, and lo and behold, Chrome immediately opened on my screen again with every tab I'd had up before gone except for the stock photo site. I wasn't even asked if I wanted to restore tabs like usual or anything. It just opened straight back up. I turned off my laptop, trying and failing to convince myself that the striking similarities to me and my apartment were a coincidence, that the creepy-ass site had just given me a virus or something, that I'd get some sleep and take my laptop to someone more tech-savvy in the morning. When I got up this morning, my laptop had disappeared. I looked all over my apartment, even though I knew I'd left it right where I'd slammed it shut last night, on the table next to the big balcony window. I am currently, to put it lightly, freaking the fuck out, and I keep seeing little inexplicable shadows darting across every room, though they actually seem to be getting bigger and bigger. This is a Hail Mary, I know, but if anyone has experience with this cursed website, or whatever the hell is going on here, I could really use some guidance. Hopefully before I'm nowhere to be found beyond the background of that photo on that godforsaken website. I am an avid secondhand shopper. I love going to charity shops and seeing what goodies they have in store. A lot of the time the items or clothes are well loved, and each thing tells a story. Me and my friends joke all the time that they were probably owned by a poor lady who died and her family decided to donate all her stuff instead of trying to find a place for it. If that is the case, then thank you, Brenda. This painting of a cat will surely find a loving home with another elderly woman, and this painting is sure to return to the shop shortly. However, the biscuit tin I found in my local cancer research shop a few weeks ago was not like this. It was in perfect condition. The cream tin was splattered with little pastel flowers. Black cursive writing that said biscuits ran across the face of the tin. It had a matching cream lid, but the handle of the tin was a pastel pink daisy. It was impossible not to fall in love with the little knick-knack. I went over and the price tag said $150. What a bargain. I snatched up the tin before anyone else could get a hold of it. I looked around the rest of the shop and found a lovely blouse, a lovely new pair of boots, and a lovely denim jacket. I dropped all the items on the counter and the cashier laughed. Now that biscuit tin keeps coming back. Hopefully you'll hang on to it. I laughed. Why does it keep coming back? Don't people like it? She looked like she wanted to say something but stopped herself. I'm not sure. It's never the person who bought it that brings it back. It's always a boyfriend or a husband who brings it back saying it has caused them nothing but trouble since it went home. She shrugged. I guess they just didn't like their partners bringing home more tat. She turned red. Not that I think it's tat or anything, I think it's really nice. I just laughed. It definitely is tat, but it'll fit into my flat perfectly. And you don't have to worry about it coming back. There's no man at my house who can bring it back. She handed me my bag and I headed home. As soon as I got in, I gave my new tin a wash and rooted through my cupboards to find my biscuits. If I was using it, then I could justify buying it. I never usually look at the homeware items, but something about this biscuit tin just drew me in. I couldn't seem to take my eyes off it. I popped the tin onto the worktop and forgot about it for the rest of the afternoon until the doorbell rang. Hello, darling. I have not seen you in a while. How have you been? As soon as the front door opened, my mom barged her way in, continuing to spew nonsense about how work has been hectic, but she just had to come and see me. She walked through my living room and into the kitchen. And then I said to Christine, "You do know Christine from work, don't you? Just look at this. What a darling little biscuit tin. Wherever did you get it?" She always exaggerated like that. I could hear the tin opening and the crunch of a biscuit. Oh, I got it from the charity shop. Apparently it kept getting brought back, so lucky me. My mom stayed for a few hours drinking all my tea and eating through several biscuits, talking about all kinds of nonsense that I wasn't particularly bothered about. It was only as I yawned and made a comment about working early the next day that she finally left, but not before taking a few more biscuits and making another comment about the biscuit tin. I had munched through a couple of biscuits myself, but was now ready to make my tea. I popped some pasta in a pan, and once it was cooked, I added a jar of sauce, warmed it up, and sat down to eat. As I took a bite, it seemed like the food on my fork just disappeared. I looked down, but I hadn't dropped the piece of pasta on myself or the floor. So I picked up another piece, making sure to keep an eye on it from fork to mouth. Same thing happened. As I went to bite, the food was missing. I was starting to get worried. I went to my fridge. Maybe I wasn't in the mood for pasta and my mind was telling me by making me drop the pasta myself, so I grabbed a yogurt. Ripped off the lid and went to lick off the yogurt that usually stays on the lid. Nothing. I looked down at the yogurt and it was gone from the lid, but I hadn't eaten it. I was starting to panic, so I started grabbing everything from the fridge that I could readily eat. Apple, bite missing but not in my mouth. Cheese, chunk missing but not in my mouth. Soup, I could see the level of liquid had gone down, but again my mouth was empty. I felt an overwhelming urge to vomit, so I ran to the sink and started heaving. All that came up was the biscuits from earlier, but rather than the new fresh ones I had opened that day, they were covered in mold. I was horrified. Surely I had not eaten moldy biscuits. I got myself a cup of water and took a sip, praying it would not disappear. Thankfully it did not, so it seems like drinks are safe. I called my mom, but my dad answered the phone. What the fuck did you do? I could hear my mom crying in the background. I burst into tears explaining what had happened to me, and my dad told me the same thing was happening to my mom. Everything she tried to eat disappeared. No matter how big the bite she took, it would vanish. The only thing we had both eaten was the biscuits from the biscuit tin, but surely that wouldn't cause food to disappear. I tried to sleep, but I tossed and turned all night. When I woke up, I tried to have breakfast, but my nicely buttered toast just disappeared. So I made my cup of tea and decided to try a biscuit from the tin. The cute pastel flowers now looked distorted and unnerving, and the black cursive gave me a sense of dread. I reached in, picked up a custard cream, and took a bite. The crunch of the biscuit resonated inside my skull, and the biscuit crumbled in my mouth and slid down my throat. So all I can eat are biscuits from the tin. Fine. I packed them in my lunchbox for work and headed off on a tiny amount of sleep and a very hungry stomach. I did get some funny looks at work eating only biscuits, but I didn't care. It would have been weirder to me to see me freaking out over my disappearing food. After I left work for the day, I went to the shop and bought several packets of biscuits, all different brands and flavors. If I'm eating biscuits for every meal for the rest of my life, I want to have some diversity. I went to the self-service tills because I did not want to have to face people while I have 30 different packets of biscuits. I suppose I could say they were for the office or for a party or something, but who would believe me if I said I could only eat biscuits because I'm cursed? Nobody would believe me, and those that were concerned enough would probably lock me up and throw away the key. Getting sectioned should have been the least of my worries. The real issue came when it was tea time. After I'd come from the shop, I put my biscuits in the ominous tin. It seemed weird to call a biscuit tin ominous, but when you're convinced it's the source of your misery, it seems appropriate to call it that. So I picked out about 15 biscuits, different flavors, so I could convince myself I was having a varied and balanced meal. I had crunched through about 12 of them. As I got to the 13th, my stomach chomped down into nothing. Now the biscuits were disappearing too. So there was a limit to how many I could eat a day. I'd had 2 for breakfast, 7 for lunch, and 12 now, so I could eat 21 a day. I'd need to start rationing, so I meal prepped. I put the biscuits into little sandwich bags and portioned them for each meal. 2 for breakfast, 5 for lunch, and 14 for tea. But this routine didn't stay the same. The next day I ate my 2 morning biscuits, my 5 lunch biscuits, but when I got to my 10th tea time biscuit, it disappeared. This pattern of disappearing biscuits has continued. I would eat less and less until now when I can only have 1 a day. My weight has dropped so rapidly, and so has my mom's, that we've both been checked into hospital. My mom is in a worse way than me. With her age, only 1 biscuit a day can't keep her going, so she's in a medically induced coma until we can find a solution to our problem. As for me, I've been prodded and poked. I've had all tests imaginable done, and I've now been given a feeding tube. I can feel the food enter my body through the tube leading directly to my stomach, but it never fills me up. It seems like once it enters my body, the food disappears. I already know there's nothing I can do. I already know that I'm going to die, and there's nothing I can do to stop it. But the one thing I do ask is, if you see a cream biscuit tin covered in flowers with a daisy handle at your local charity shop, don't buy it. I groaned inwardly as the first drops of rain began to fall. I had planned everything so meticulously, the exact date so it wouldn't interfere with work, the flight booking, searching the internet for hours on end for the perfect location, only to overlook something so obvious: the bloody weather. I cursed under my breath as the rain picked up momentum, covering the windshield of my newly rented car. To make matters worse, I was starting to think I was lost. I was out here because I needed to get away from it all. Eat, sleep, work. The same routine month after month. It was driving me crazy. So I decided to take advantage of my paid leave and book a log cabin all the way in Finland. Just me, alone in a forest in the middle of nowhere for an entire week. So here I was, on some obscure network of roads, surrounded by dark, impenetrable woodland. The wind whistled like a siren as I tried to figure out the direction I was supposed to be heading in. At this point, the drumming of the rain was all I could hear. My GPS had lost signal, and I could barely see through the windows. I could just about make out a yellow blur through the windshield, which I assumed was a sign offering directions. I rolled the window down, hoping to read it from the shelter of the car, but winced when the water immediately splashed inside. I rolled the window back up. This wasn't my car after all, and I had to return it in perfect condition. Steeling myself, I pulled the hood of my jacket up and opened the door. Immediately the rain hammered itself upon me in a relentless fashion, leaving me drenched as I miserably trudged towards the bright yellow sign, which fortunately had what I was looking for. The resort where my cabin is located should be no more than 2 kilometers away. I was about to turn and leave, but from the corner of my eye, I noticed some words hastily sprayed on the sign. Beware of the VI. What on earth was that supposed to mean? No idea. The letters were washed out and fading, and it wasn't visible to read the rest of the word. I shrugged it off. I was only getting wetter the longer I stayed out here, so I hastily walked back to my car. Throwing it into gear, I stepped on the accelerator and made my way down to the cabin, feeling ever so slightly uneasy. The sky was black as char by the time I reached the cabin, but the moon cast just enough light to see the surrounding area, painting an eerie glow over everything in sight. I was in a clearing surrounded by tall pine trees with branches that swayed in the wind. It looked like they were waving at me, but not in a particularly welcoming fashion. I parked the car just in front of the cabin and hurried to the door, bringing my bag with me. I unlocked it and stepped inside. It was dark inside the house. I was going to have to hook up the generator tomorrow to get the lights working. For now, I used my phone's flash to guide me upstairs to the bedroom, changed out of my wet clothes, and lay down on the bed. It took me a long time to finally sleep. The rain hadn't eased off the slightest since yesterday, so I was stuck indoors. I spent most of the day exploring the cabin, which had a pretty simple layout. The ground floor had a living room with 2 leather couches and a log fire between them. Across from it was the kitchen, which luckily had running water. Upstairs was the bedroom I slept in last night, a bathroom, and a small additional room which I assumed was for storage. I happened to be in that room now, slumped against the wall playing games on my phone to pass the time, miserable that my plans of exploring the great outdoors were ruined. I also couldn't figure out how to start up the generator, so the house had no electricity, which meant no lights. I admit, I lost track of time, and hours later I realized it was almost midnight. I hauled myself up, and upon turning the flash on my phone on, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. A scrunched up piece of paper pushed into the corner of the room near the doorway. I picked it up and smoothed it out, squinting to read the hastily scrawled message. When the visitor comes, don't let it in. My feeling of unease grew as I remembered the warning I encountered on the sign yesterday. Could it possibly be related to this? Who on earth was the visitor? As if to answer my question, something started knocking on the front door. If I was uneasy before, now I was completely creeped out. Rather than go to the door, I quietly made my way to the bedroom, which faced the front of the house, and tiptoed to the window. I couldn't see the doorstep, so I held my breath and slowly opened it, craning my neck to see who it was. Through the darkness, I could see the silhouette of someone standing by the door. Whoever they were, they didn't look particularly tall or threatening. The cabin wasn't far off from the road. Perhaps their car had broken down or something and they needed help. Still, I wasn't taking any chances, so I grabbed the curtain rail from the top of the window and pulled it down to use as a potential weapon. Quietly, I walked down the stairs to the front door and looked through the peephole. I breathed a sigh of relief when I saw who it was. An old, harmless-looking woman. "Hello?" she called out. "Anyone home?" I turned the key and opened the door, seeing her properly for the first time. She was definitely old, probably in her 60s. What the hell was she doing out here in the middle of the night? "Hey," I said, "is everything okay?" "Well, you see..." Her voice faltered as she noticed the curtain rail in my hand. I hastily propped it against the wall and she resumed talking. "You see, I'm ever so slightly lost. I was out picking berries and I strayed from my usual route, and then it got dark and I've been wandering around for hours now." What was I supposed to do? Tell her to go away because I saw some creepy note which was most likely just a prank? Make her wander around for another few hours in the dark while there was a bloody thunderstorm? She was obviously harmless, so I let her in. Luckily, she insisted on sleeping on the couch and promised to leave first thing in the morning, which was fine by me. Now I was back upstairs, laying on the bed while tossing and turning relentlessly. I couldn't stop thinking about that note I found. In the end, I figured since I wasn't sleeping anytime soon, I may as well do something. I grabbed my phone and opened Google. Here goes nothing. I muttered as I keyed in "the visitor" and pressed search. Unsurprisingly, nothing relevant showed up. Not to be deterred, I began delving deeper, typing in more specific searches. Eventually, I came across an article on some obscure wiki which was supposedly about urban legends and unexplained events. It looked promising, so I opened the page and began reading. The visitor is a shape-shifting entity that originates from an old Finnish folktale which dates back hundreds of years. Yet many people believe its existence to be real. Several people have even claimed to have witnessed it firsthand. Sources provided below. I skipped several transcripts of interviews and continued reading. According to tradition, the visitor has a weakness. It cannot enter any dwelling or structure unless it is given permission. However, the visitor is cunning. Being a shapeshifter, it will assume the form of something else, typically the least intimidating thing it can think of, in a bid to gain entry. Once it is inside, it will usually wait until its victims are asleep, or at the very least until nightfall, as it is powerless during the day. Then it will revert back to its true form and murder them, in an extremely brutal fashion. Immediately my thoughts went to the old woman I'd invited inside. I began shaking. My blood turned to ice and my heart started pounding in my chest once I had realized what I'd done. I'd just let the visitor in, and now I could hear the stairs creaking. Adrenaline pumped through my veins as I frantically grabbed my keys and rushed to the window. Throwing it open, I leapt out and hit the ground hard. Seconds later, I heard the window explode as shards of glass rained down on my back. Winded and bleeding, I staggered over to the car and leapt inside, turning the key in the ignition. Just as I slammed my foot on the accelerator, I heard a massive thud behind me. Whatever the visitor's true form looked like, it was big. Heart pounding, I sped down the road as it gave chase, emitting loud, guttural growls. I glanced at the rear mirror and saw the abomination for the first time. It was a hellish being, huge and skeletal with a grinning, skull-like face. It was humanoid but dropped down on all fours as it continued to chase me. It was fast, although apparently not fast enough to catch up with a car going near 100 miles per hour. I watched it through the mirror as the terrifying beast began getting smaller and smaller. At that moment, I really believed I was going to get away. Then I lost control of the car. It violently wobbled side to side as I wrestled with the wheel, trying to get it under control. I coughed as I started to inhale the smell of burning rubber as the car began screeching to a halt. I realized at that moment that I must have punctured a tire. I desperately tried to get the car to move, but it was no use. There was nothing I could do. Sobbing and shaking, I held my head in my hands and waited for it all to end. Minutes passed, yet nothing happened. I looked up and a wave of relief hit me as a police officer walked towards my car. He was holding a flashlight and what looked like a gun holstered on his hip. "It's okay," he called out. "I've taken care of it. You can come out now." I was about to open the door but hesitated. I wasn't buying it. Why was an officer out here in the first place? Why hadn't I heard gunshots or the sound of a struggle? "Sir?" called the officer sharply. "I need you to exit the vehicle immediately for your own safety." I slammed the horn of the car to drown out his voice. The visitor had tricked me once. It wasn't going to fool me again. The supposed police officer pulled out his gun, pointing it at me and yelling that he would shoot if I didn't open the door. I ignored him. It was all an illusion. So long as I don't let it in or leave the car, I was safe. Eventually the visitor gave up and transformed back to its true form. I stared at its grotesque face, unable to look away. Its skin was stretched tightly over its skull and it had a grinning, serrated smile. However, when I looked into its smoldering eyes, I saw undisguised rage. It stared me down what seemed like an eternity, before turning and disappearing into the night. Head spinning, I slumped back into the seat, struggling to comprehend what had transpired in the past 24 hours. Eventually I fell asleep, or passed out. I wasn't entirely sure by the time I was awake, but it was midday. I changed the tire as quickly as I possibly could and drove away, leaving the nightmare that was the last few days behind me. When you are younger, your world is full of holes. Gaps in your understanding of how the world connects together in terms of location, but also in terms of laws. When I was little, my living room looked out into a valley that ended in a giant wall of trees. I spent my whole life wondering what could possibly be in the world beyond those trees that I'd never seen. That got put to rest when I looked on Google Maps years later and found out that beyond those trees was where my best friend Mitchell's house was. As you get older and understand more about the world around you, the gaps just sort of fill in. When I was little, Mitchell and I, as well as two of our other friends, Andrew and Katie, would go to the park right next to my house with our short-range walkie-talkies and go exploring through all the little side trails in the woods. We could keep in contact within a few hundred feet, but we couldn't really talk to each other. If one of us was outside the forest and the others were inside, we'd find all kinds of things. Big stumps with roughly child-sized burrows in them, collections of beer bottles and burnt-out cigarettes that appeared overnight, and strange formations of trees that looked like they had to have been arranged purposefully, as the clearings they formed looked too precise to be natural. We joked that it was the forest folk, and that we'd have to get out of there before dark if we didn't want to be taken away. Mitchell was the one who knew the forest best, and as such, he was often the leader of our expeditions. Most of the time we ended up going to landmarks that Mitchell had found previously and wanted to show us. He spent a lot of time in that park. We almost never went to his house. Mitchell mentioned that his parents argued a lot and the only times he invited us over were when they weren't there. Maybe he spent a lot of time in the woods because he felt more comfortable there than he was at home. That might explain why he was so excited when he found the house. One morning he called the house practically in a frenzy. He was calling me, Andrew, and Katie together to explore the woods as soon as we could that day. He said that he'd found the coolest thing he'd seen yet. Since I'd lived right next to the park, it only took a few minutes to be there. When I got there, Mitchell wouldn't stop beaming. He barely said a word as we walked down the trail, answering every question with, "It's a surprise." He led us down the usual trail, then showed us an opening in the bushes between two small side trails that we'd already explored. The opening was so small we would have never seen it without Mitchell pointing it out, but it did lead to a side trail. The trail led through a blackberry patch, the brambles creating a tunnel that we had to crawl on our hands and knees to get through. When we emerged from the tunnel, I couldn't believe my eyes. The tunnel led into a massive clearing completely surrounded by trees and thorny bushes but open to the beaming sunlight. In the middle of the clearing was a small, grassy hill, on top of which stood a burnt pile of wreckage with a single, barely held together charred suitcase extending up out of it. Katie just about lost her mind. She started laughing and hollering and demanding to know how Mitchell had found this when we had been exploring the forest for months and had never even found a clue that this was there. Mitchell laughed and said he had no idea. He just found the trail while walking the previous day, saw the house, then immediately left and decided to call us the next day. We spent the day exploring the clearing. There was really nothing there except for the house. It had been so badly burnt that we had no way of knowing anything about it except that it had 2 floors, judging by the staircase. There was no path leading to the house, no driveway, and no sign of anything resembling a porch. We weren't sure what to do with the house now that we'd found it. I think we were just happy to have found something that it looked like nobody else knew about. The sense of accomplishment from a discovery of this size outweighed the actual usefulness of the discovery. We ended up using the house as a meeting spot. Before then, we'd always met at the entrance to the wooded section of the park near the playground. Now we met at Mitchell's house. We figured that, since he discovered it, it was his. Mitchell took care of his new house. He'd insist that we wipe our feet before coming in, even though the floor was made of crumbled charcoal. During our meetings, he'd be working on finding large pieces of charred wood to use as barriers of demarcation between rooms, and even finding pieces that were large enough to stake into the ground and use as walls for the house itself. He even made a makeshift guardrail for the suitcase so that we wouldn't fall unless that rickety death trap collapsed. Over time, the burnt-out pile of rubble became home to us. However, after about a month, we started noticing small changes. The walls around the house began to look more solid, and the floor started to look less like crumpled charcoal and more like charred wood. We chalked this up to Mitchell cleaning up when we weren't around, until we found the door. One day, when we went to the house, there was a front door. The walls had gotten up to about half the door's height at this point, so it only had one set of hinges, but it still stood shut. Andrew started to get creeped out and suggested that maybe we shouldn't keep hanging out here. I felt a similar queasy feeling. Mitchell looked troubled, but eventually suggested that maybe they were rebuilding the house. The rest of us reluctantly agreed. A construction crew rebuilding a house with no security, no equipment, and fresh building supplies that looked pre-burnt made sense to a group of children desperately trying to search for an explanation. Our meetings at the house were less frequent after that. We were all a little sad that we weren't the only ones who knew about it, and we didn't know that whatever or whoever was rebuilding the house wanted us to hang around it. We would briefly meet outside the house, then go off on our adventures outside of the clearing. Every time we'd go there, the house would be a little less dirty. The walls would be a little cleaner, revealing a sickly light green paint on the outside of the house. They would also be taller and more solid. We could no longer see through the walls on the outside of the house and would have to stand on our tiptoes to peek inside. One day I saw a leather chair inside of what must have been the living room. On one of these days, we decided to play a game of Roger in the woods. We'd choose one of us to close our eyes and count to 150, and the rest of us would hide. Whoever had to count would have to find all of us. Whoever was looking for us could turn on their walkie-talkie and say Roger. Everyone else would have to say Roger back. This way, if the seeker was close by, the hider would have to say Roger really quietly, but not make it obvious that they were whispering. If anyone left their button on by mistake or said anything that wasn't Roger, they'd lose. Mitchell had already beaten us several times by saying that his mother was calling for him and that the game was over, only for us all to respond with a non-Roger statement and hand him the win. This time, Katie was the seeker. She closed her eyes at the entrance to the woods and we all dashed into the trees. Mitchell and Andrew stayed close to me for a while, but when we got to the path to Mitchell's house, they both opened up the bushes and crawled into the tunnel. I leaned in and whispered that it might not be a good idea to hide there for a long time since we might run into whoever's been rebuilding the house. They told me that was the point of hiding, and I gave up. I hid behind a tree on the opposite side of the trail from the entrance and waited for Katie to come by. I heard the first noise from my walkie-talkie not long after. Roger. It was Katie's voice. Roger, I whispered, trying to trick her into thinking I was close by. I couldn't see her, so I knew she was pretty far off. Roger, crackled Andrew and Mitchell through the walkie-talkie. I listened carefully. I could hear footsteps crunching up the gravel trail, slowly and methodically. I held my breath. Katie had to have gotten a quick start. She knew that we wouldn't have hidden too close to the playground. The footsteps continued up near the tree, then stopped. It took everything not to peek out from behind the tree, but I knew that if she was looking this way, I was finished. I felt a hiccup coming. I held my breath and clenched my throat muscles to keep it down. It continued pushing up, but Katie refused to move. I heard another crunching noise. The footsteps were moving further away. I heard a rustling and realized that Katie was going into the tunnel. I almost laughed. Mitchell hiding at the house was too predictable. He loved that place. Of course he'd hide there. When the rustling was too far away for me to hear, I let out a sigh. As soon as I did, I felt a hand on my shoulder. Got you. I nearly jumped out of my skin. I rolled around to see Katie's grinning face. I knew you wouldn't hear me coming. The trail is too noisy, so I went through the trees. Chill ran up my spine. I grabbed the walkie-talkie and pressed the button to speak. Mitchell? Andrew? Someone's coming through the tunnel. It's not Katie. There was no response. Katie turned to me. What? There's someone going in there? Yeah, I said. I thought it was you. My heart was pounding in my chest. I turned the walkie-talkie on again. I'm not joking. Someone's coming and I don't know who it is. Again, there was no response. I started shaking. I pulled out the walkie-talkie again. Roger? Roger. In Mitchell's voice. Roger. Andrew's voice. Roger. Garbled, staticky screams erupted from our walkie-talkies. Katie and I put our backs flat against the tree and covered our ears. Katie grabbed the walkie-talkies and switched them off so that whoever was in there wouldn't hear us. As soon as we switched them off, it was silent. We couldn't hear a thing beyond the rustling of birds and squirrels in the bushes around us. I started breathing heavily. Katie put her hand over my mouth. I was about to pull it back when I heard it. A dry scraping sound coming from the other side of the trail. The sound of someone coming through the tunnel. The bushes in front of the tunnel rustled and we heard two faint crunches on the gravel path. We knew it could be either Mitchell and Andrew, or whoever followed them in there, and we knew that it probably wasn't Mitchell and Andrew. We held our breaths, waiting desperately for whoever it was to either give a signal as to who they were or leave. Finally, we heard a crunching sound. They were walking deeper into the forest. Katie and I waited for what seemed like an hour. When we didn't hear anything, we slowly poked our heads around the tree. There was nobody in sight. We crept onto the trail, stepping as carefully as we could so as to make as little sound as possible. We both looked at each other and, without a word, started moving toward the tunnel. We parted the bushes and crawled inside. The crawl through the tunnel took about 2 minutes, but that day, it felt like an eternity. The only sounds I could hear were the scraping sounds that Katie and I made against the dirt as we dragged ourselves through. The whole way, I was certain that I would hear the bushes behind us rustling, then something dragging its way down the tunnel towards us. Miraculously, we reached the end. I pulled open the bushes and crawled out into the clearing, and what I saw made my jaw drop. What stood in front of us was a house. Not a burnt-out shell, or even the partially rebuilt ruins that we had been seeing for the past several visits, but a perfectly ordinary suburban house. It was painted a sickly light green, had 2 stories, and all the curtains were open with the lights off inside. I walked forward to get a closer look, but Katie grabbed my shoulders and leaned closer to my ear. Mitchell's house. My heart dropped into my stomach. It was. The same shade of paint, the same layout, the same everything. I could even see the furniture of Mitchell's living room through the bay window at the house's front. Katie and I turned and ran. We practically dove headfirst into the tunnel and started pulling ourselves through as fast as we could. The whole time I could see the opening and just picture the sunlight suddenly getting cut off by the shadow of something's head, gazing eagerly into the tunnel. We emerged, covered in dirt and thorns, and sprinted out of the forest screaming. Needless to say, we found help quickly. One of the people at the park called for help, and the authorities went searching through the woods for 2 missing children. They never found Mitchell. I only learned the details about Andrew years later. Katie and I told them everything about the clearing, the house, and the thing that almost caught us that day. When they combed the forest, they never found a clearing, a house, or a tunnel in the spot where we said it was. The only thing it led them to was Andrew. They found him in the middle of the woods, burned beyond recognition. They only knew it was him from his dental records. There were no signs of a fire around him. The disappearance and death haunted our neighborhood. Katie and I were never really allowed to go into the woods again, or out after dark at all. We still hung out, but only at one of our houses and only with adult supervision. Over the next few months, things didn't return to normal. But we slowly learned to live with where we were in the world now. One night when I was about to go to sleep, I heard a muffled noise from my closet, like paper rustling or a running tap. I froze for a second, not wanting to come face to face with whatever killed Andrew. I crept my way over to the closet before hearing it again. I froze. It wasn't paper moving. It was too mechanical. I steeled my nerves and threw open the closet door. Sitting on a pile of papers in my closet was my walkie-talkie. I must have left it on the last time I hung out with Katie. I picked it up and sure enough it was switched on. That's when I heard it. Roger. Even through the static there was no mistaking it. It was Mitchell's voice. Roger. His voice was like dead leaves rubbing together. Roger. I swear I could hear him choking back a sob as he said it. I smashed the walkie-talkie against the wall. The batteries flew out, but I kept hitting it against the wall until the plastic had broken and the circuitry had been exposed. I curled up on the floor and cried. I never experienced anything like that again. The years passed by and my life reached some kind of normalcy. Katie and I still keep in touch. I'm finishing up my last year of college now. I'm studying to become a forensic scientist. I learned about dental records and fingerprinting and all the things they probably tried to use to identify Andrew's killer. But through all of this, I know they'll never find what did it. You see, the memories of the incident come and go, and recently, I was fixating on it harder than I have in years. I finally decided to confront my fears as much as I could on my limited schedule, and I started looking into where I lived at the time, where all the streets were, what businesses there were in the town, and how the park was situated. I ended up looking on Google Maps. I'd never used it to look at my hometown, and I was kind of shocked at how everything ended up connecting. Katie and Andrew lived way closer together than I thought. The library and the grocery store were a few hundred feet away on opposite sides of a wall, and Mitchell just lived on the other side of the hill that I had always thought of trekking over. Then I looked at the park. The map was fairly detailed. They even mapped out a lot of the side trails. Needless to say, the tunnel didn't exist on the map. I didn't know why I even bothered looking for it. Then my blood froze. Of course the tunnel didn't exist. The tunnel couldn't have existed, because if the tunnel existed on the map and went as far as I remembered it going, the clearing with the burnt out house would have been in my backyard. When you're younger, your world is full of holes, gaps in your understanding of how the world connects together in terms of location, and also in terms of laws. As you get older and you understand more about the world around you, most of the gaps just sort of fill in. But Mitchell's house is a gap that I suspect will never be filled in. And if I'm being honest, I'm not sure I ever want it to be. Because I don't know what kind of gaps any answer will create. When I was 9, my family moved to a military base because of my parents' relocations. That meant packing up 7 kids and moving them into a house. An old house. A house that harbored secrets my family was ignorant to. The first day we moved in, I will remember forever. It was the last time I remember being happy in that house. The last time I remember the whole family being happy, collectively. We all helped each other move boxes into new rooms. We each got our own, which was unheard of in our big family. My older brothers were ecstatic, racing each other up the staircase to grab the biggest ones. I took my time. I slowly walked up the stairs with my box of art supplies and studied the house. It was old, no doubt about it. In fact, it still had an old rotary phone hanging up on a wall in the foyer. I made a mental note to check if it still worked and made my way up to the hallway. I could plainly see where my brothers had gone. Their footsteps had disturbed the thin layer of dust that had settled on the wood. I turned the opposite way and turned into the first room. The room chilled me to the bone. Though the room was supposed to face the front of the house, pointing toward the west and the setting sun, the room remained barren, cold, and dark. It was as if the window allowed no light through the thick layers of grime that covered them. I backed out of the room quickly, not wanting to spend another moment in there. I walked farther down the hall until I came to a slightly larger room. Unlike the first room, it was flooded with the afternoon sun, and I fell in love with the light blue paint that brightened up the room. All it had was a metal bed frame and a closet. I set the box down on the bed frame, claiming the room, and made my way down to the truck to grab the rest of my things. Hours later, my brothers, all 6 of them, decided to explore the house. My 3 older brothers, Donovan, Flynn, and Duncan, decided they'd explore the 3rd floor first, and that I'd take the younger ones to the basement. As the only girl, I had a reputation to uphold, so I agreed. I decided I'd have to keep an eye on all of them so they wouldn't get hurt. I ordered Jared, only a year younger than me, to hold on to Jeremy, and I'd hang on to the youngest, Isaac. We made quite a racket, tromping down the stairs of the basement. "Be careful," came my father's call. "We will," we all chorused. I flicked the light switch and we started our exploration. I turned to face my brothers and adopted my bossy, older sister persona. I don't want to see anyone going off where I can't see them. We don't know the house. We don't know what's in it. If you find something dangerous, or you aren't sure what it could be, leave it alone, got it? My brothers nodded in sync, and so we continued. "Ronnie, look over here." I heard Jared call. I brought Isaac with me to have a look. He had found a shelving unit full of old nails, screws, tools, and pieces of wood. To me, it looked to be a workbench. "No touching, there's nails," I reminded him. Jared rolled his eyes. "Yes, Mom." I smiled despite his jab and looked down to Isaac. "Where should we go next?" Isaac's face lit up and he pointed to the other side of the basement. My heart dropped when he pointed. That side of the basement was shrouded in darkness and had given me a bad vibe when we'd gone near it. But he looked so excited that I couldn't deny him a chance to look. "Okay, come on, guys." All 4 of us started walking into the darkness. My skin crawled. My arms erupted in goosebumps as we got closer. Apparently I wasn't the only one apprehensive. Though Isaac had been the one curious, he suddenly got cold feet. "I don't want to anymore," he cried, his eyes brimming with tears. I sighed in relief and heeded his wish, ending the trip and directing us all to the well-lit side of the basement. My older brothers got bored of the 3rd floor and came to join us. "What'd you guys find?" Flynn asked. At 13, he was in the stage where he both hated us and loved us. A confusing time for me, who was suddenly his most hated sibling. "Not much. There's a workbench over there, though." I pointed to the right side of the stairs. "What about over there?" Donovan asked, pointing to the unlit section we'd abandoned. "We didn't explore that part yet," I covered quickly. Duncan caught my lie. "Guys, Veronica's scared." Duncan mocked. Flynn and Donovan smiled. "Really? Still scared of the dark, Ronnie?" I shrugged. Isaac didn't want to go anymore. I didn't either. My brothers gave up on teasing me. They knew I wasn't one to be riled up after dealing with their crap for 4 years before Jared showed up. "Ronnie, I don't want to go," Isaac said, his voice laced with fear. "Me either." Jeremy voiced from next to Jared. "How about you guys go upstairs and help Mom and Dad unpack? They'd love the help," I suggested. Isaac and Jeremy smiled and raced each other back up the stairs, slamming the door behind them. I could hear the muffled reprimand from Mom about slamming doors. "Are you losers coming?" Flynn called, walking deeper into the darkness. Though my whole body protested, I followed them. Jared stayed close to me, which I was thankful for. Someone turned on a flashlight and illuminated the room. Whoa. came from Duncan, who punched Flynn on the arm. "Look at that." My eyes followed theirs, and my eyes landed on a noose hanging from the rafters. Nausea crept its way up my throat as the fraying rope swayed in a non-existent breeze. Jared grasped my arm and squeezed. "Don't touch it, morons. Come on," Donovan ordered, smacking Flynn's hand away when he tried. Jared and I quickly caught up to Donovan, leaving the noose to sway back and forth behind us. I noticed the door. "Jared, you see that?" I asked. Jared looked at the small wooden door that stood at the back corner of the basement. Jared nodded. "Don," Jared called. Donovan came, trailed by Flynn and Duncan. "No way," Flynn whispered, jogging over to the small door. "Hey, be careful, idiot. I don't need you dying," Donovan called, walking closer with the flashlight. "Shut up. It's just a cellar door. Look." He opened it, the metal hinges screaming as it swung open. A smell wafted from inside. Flynn recoiled and covered his nose with his shirt. "What is that?" he exclaimed. We all took a closer look and had the same reaction. Though the smell was unmistakable and horrible, the little room seemed to have no indication of where it was coming from. The room was small, about 4 foot by 4 foot and only 5 feet tall. It was enough for Jared and I to stand straight in, though the older boys had to bend down. Donovan flicked his light around inside. It had a dirt floor. The ground was covered in old cans and what looked to be toys for a child. Small wooden trains and carved army men. A small kerosene lantern lay on its side in one corner. Though the scene was creepy, there was nothing inside to explain the smell. "Creepy," Duncan voiced. "Totally," Flynn parroted. "Who wants to go in?" Flynn asked, a sly grin on his face. I took a big step back with Jared. No way was I going into that room. Jared agreed with me. "Dude, just close the door. It smells horrible." Donovan censored, remembering to watch his mouth around us kids after a lecture from Mom and Dad. "Fine," Flynn whined, closing the door. "Race you upstairs, though." He suddenly yelled. A smile broke out on my face as I raced my brothers to the top of the stairs, coming in second behind Duncan. "I win," Duncan bragged, opening the basement door. "Flynn, you got beat by Ronnie," Donovan teased, coming in third. "What? She's fast." I didn't tell them the reason I was so fast was because I was terrified of the basement and that tiny room. Something inside there made me feel sick and wrong. Something old and dark. Weeks passed by. I started to notice just how oppressive the house was. I also noticed how it affected us. Donovan was much more sullen. He was always in his room with his music. He didn't play with us kids anymore, and he sure as hell didn't talk to us anymore. Flynn and Duncan became more reserved. Their playful, competitive nature seemed to dull and taper off. They were very close in age, only 10 months apart, and so when they started sharing a room, we really didn't see the issue with it. That is, until the only people they seemed to talk to were each other. Jared attached to me. He'd always been close. He was my kid brother, my best friend. But as the weeks crawled by, he seemed to become my shadow, following me everywhere. I didn't mind. In fact, I felt he was safer if he wasn't wandering through the halls of that house. Jeremy became irate. He was always a quiet kid. He played quiet. He cried quiet. He did everything quiet. That is, until the house. He would throw these tantrums of epic proportions. He was 6, but he threw fits of something half his age. Anything could have set him off. It could have been Donovan sitting next to him at dinner, or maybe I walked past him in the hall and accidentally brushed against him. Everyone avoided Jeremy. Isaac? I think Isaac was more like me. He didn't change much. In fact, he seemed hyper-aware of what was happening. Jared, Isaac, and I would all bunk in my room most nights. It seemed mine was the only one they could sleep in, and I didn't mind at all. I welcomed it. The longer we stayed, the worse Jeremy got. One day, Donovan went missing. I was the first one to notice. He hadn't come down for lunch. I walked upstairs to his room and knocked. He didn't answer like he usually did. I opened the door and he wasn't there. That was highly unusual for him. In fact, it sent cold fear through me. I knocked on Duncan and Flynn's room. "What?" Flynn called. "I can't find Donovan," I called through the door. The patter of footsteps indicated someone was coming to the door. Duncan opened the door, his eyes marred with deep bags. All us kids seemed to have them. "What?" I pointed down the hall. I checked his room. He never leaves his room. That seemed to alert Duncan and Flynn to start looking. Jared and I checked all the bedrooms and bathrooms. We checked the third floor. We checked the playroom and then made our way downstairs. Somewhere along the way, all 5 of us ended up at the basement door. Duncan opened it and walked down the steps, followed by Flynn. Jared and I looked at each other. Isaac pulled on my hand. "Come on," he said, pulling me down with him. Duncan and Flynn checked the workbench first, but didn't find him. Then we looked over to the left side. It seemed darker. I hadn't been down there since the day we moved in, but the darkness seemed thicker, deeper. Isaac and Jared grabbed each of my hands. I squeezed. Duncan and Flynn started yelling suddenly. We raced over and came upon a scene I'll always remember. Flynn had tackled Jeremy. He was holding him down in the corner of the basement. Even though there was a 6-year age gap, Flynn was struggling to keep him contained. Duncan opened the small door which had been stuck. Donovan came flying out, covered in dirt and grime. His face was covered in tears, chest heaving. "Dude, what happened?" Duncan asked, trying to help Donovan up. Donovan struggled to stand and looked at Duncan with wild eyes. He locked me in," he stuttered, his voice shaking. "Who?" I asked. Donovan looked at Jeremy. He held the door closed, and he wouldn't let me out. He kept laughing. Donovan rambled, taking steps back from Jeremy and Flynn. Suddenly, Jeremy erupted in laughter. It was deep, dark, hysterical laughter that wasn't even close to that of a little boy's. Flynn quickly crawled away, looking at Jeremy like he was insane. Jeremy sat in the corner and threw his head back in laughter. "What the hell's wrong with you?" Duncan exploded at Jeremy. "You could have killed him. There's no circulation in there. He could have suffocated." Duncan yelled. Jeremy's laughing stopped as soon as it had started and faced us. A smile slowly crept along his face. "Yay," he said and laughed again. We told our parents what happened. They forbade Jeremy from going into the basement again. Donovan seemed fine, though shaken. I asked him what had happened, and he simply looked at me and said, "There's something wrong with him, Veronica. He's not." And then he trailed off. I knew what he was thinking, though. Jeremy wasn't himself anymore. It happened again. Next, it was Flynn. Then, it was Duncan. I feared it was me next. I was terrified of my brother, and I hated it. I hated the house for making him that way. I hated the basement most of all. It lived down there. It festered all its hate down there. I remember the day it was my turn. Mom and Dad left us home alone for the upteenth time. Donovan had orders to watch us all. Never did, though. He locked himself in his room and played his music. I was downstairs making lunch for the younger kids. I was finished making the sandwiches and poured a glass of milk for Jared and Isaac. I didn't do it for Jeremy. He spent all his time in the basement anyway. He never came up when I called, so what was the point? "Ronnie," came Jeremy's sing-song voice. It chilled my blood. "What?" I asked quickly. "Come downstairs." I shook my head. "I'm eating." I started taking a bite of my sandwich. Come on, please? I stared at him. You will not lock me in there. Not like them. Go away. Jeremy's creepy smile flipped in an instant. He stalked away, stomping down the basement steps. I let out a sigh of relief. We ate the rest of the lunch in silence. An hour after, I heard a scream. It was Isaac's scream. Veronica! I heard him call, sobs following after. I ran down the steps and flung open the basement door. At the bottom sat Isaac holding his arm. Jared, call Mom and Dad. Jared gave a quick nod and ran to the landline. I ran down the basement steps. My arm. He sobbed, holding it to his chest. Let me see. He removed his other arm and I almost gasped, but contained myself. His elbow was bent at an unnatural angle. Broken, definitely. What happened, bud? I asked, taking my jacket off. I was always cold in the house. Always. I ran to the workbench and grabbed some shears, cutting part of it to make a makeshift sling. I was walking by the basement door and then Jared... I finished tying his arm to his chest and then stopped. Jared did this? Isaac nodded. He pushed me. He son. I heard quick footsteps behind me. Isaac, go upstairs as quick as you can and get Jared. Tell him to get done. Something grabbed my hair and I was yanked backward, being dragged by something unnaturally strong. I managed to hear Isaac's quick footsteps as he ran upstairs. I knew it was Jeremy. I could hear his laughter. Jeremy, let me go. I yelled. Tears poured down my cheeks from the pain of him pulling my hair, coupled with the concrete scraping my back and shoulders. Too quickly we stopped. I heard the screaming of the hinges as the door opened. I twisted around to see the old cellar door. Jeremy, no. Please, please don't. He grabbed me and somehow managed to shove me into the room and slam the door shut. The dark was suffocating. My heart was beating so fast I thought it would explode. Jeremy, please, I screamed, banging on the wooden door. I knew it was pointless, but I had to try. I heard the unmistakable sound of a match being lit from behind me. I whipped around to find the kerosene lamp being lit with a match by a small boy about Jared's age. He put the match out and then looked at me. The screaming won't do. He won't listen. The boy said in a hushed voice. Who are you? I asked. The boy smiled and extended his arm. Hi, I'm Kent, but you can call me the boy. Everyone does. I pressed myself against the wooden door and stared. He wasn't from my time period. He wore dirty overalls and no shirt. His feet were bare and caked in dirt along with his face and hair. You're different than the rest. Most scream. I shook my head in disbelief. You're dead. He smiled, his teeth or lack thereof showing. You're quick too. I was locked down here just like you. My final resting place. He leaned against the wall. My daddy didn't like me much. Kept me down here a lot, but Grandpappy, he made me these. He picked up a wooden train caked in grime. He used to carve away. I'd hear him humming his special song. Then he'd open the door and hand me one of these. He handed me the train. I tentatively took it. My daddy wasn't a bad man. This place, it made him bad. Like it made that boy bad. Kent said, nodding his head to Jeremy outside the door. There's something dark in this house. It's taken a liking to him like it took a liking to my daddy. If you know what's best, you'd leave forever and ever. Kent said, matter of fact. What happens to him? I found myself asking. Kent sighed. I take it you've seen the news? I nod. He's going to do something he'll regret, and then when he finally gets clear, he'll use that noose just as my daddy did. Kent said. My whole body felt cold as I listened to his story, his warning. Was Jeremy capable of murder? Could he kill us? I have to go, but if you come back down sometime, I'll tell you the rest, Ken said, picking up the lantern. You'll be fine. You're a smart one. And then he blew out the flame. I didn't have time to be afraid of the dark. Suddenly I fell back into the basement and Donovan was standing over me. Ronnie. He cried, lifting me up and hugging me tight. Come on, Mom and Dad are coming home. He picked me up and took me up the stairs. I could have walked, but I let him. Isaac got a cast. We all signed it. Jeremy was admitted into the hospital psych ward. When we all corroborated Isaac's story and Mom and Dad realized Jeremy had locked 4 of us into the cellar, they knew something had to be done. As long as Jeremy was away from the house, he was fine. He didn't show signs of violent behavior. Visiting him in the hospital was the only time I'd seen him like himself in months. I finally convinced my parents to leave. Dad was getting relocated anyway. We packed all our things and we said goodbye to that evil house and the thing that lived inside. I fear that if we'd stayed just a bit longer, one of us might have met the same fate as Kent and his family. I never lost the memories of that house. When I got my first laptop at age 21, I looked it up. It had a long history, but somehow I came to what I wanted to find. In the early 1900s, there was a man named Peter Atlas who bought the house along with his father, Gregory Atlas. Peter had a son, Kenneth Atlas. They lived there for 3 years. When the mail started piling up and they hadn't been to church, a neighbor stopped by. He found Peter first in the basement, hanging from the noose. Gregory was found in the garden, buried. Kenneth was found in the cellar. He had asphyxiated from being locked inside for a day. Every year I check to see if someone's moved in. It's listed on a website online. All it is a quick search. For years it's been empty. Since we moved back in 1983, it's been empty. Today the website listed it as sold. My therapist came up with a way for me to better deal with my negative, self-critical thoughts. I have many of them. You're such a loser. You suck. That was incredibly stupid. These came at me multiple times a day. She shared that for a start. I'm to realize that these thoughts all come from my inner critic, and they are not necessarily true. My inner critic can insult and taunt me all she wants, but she has no power over me once I realize that whatever she lobbies at me are just thoughts. And thoughts do not equal reality. We started off by naming my inner critic. I decided to name her Katrina. I was also asked to draw how I thought she looked like. So with my limited drawing skills, I scrawled out a tall, skinny lady with a long, sharp nose who was perpetually tight-lipped and frowning. It can sometimes be a pretty fun way to deal with my negative thoughts. For example, if I had thoughts like, you dumbass, you're a failure, and so on, I would snap back out loud, shut up, Katrina. I also started drawing her into comic strips. I'd feature her as a clumsy, stupid villain, while my protective side, named Harriet, was the kick-ass heroine. Coming up with a name and character for my kinder, more self-compassionate side was my idea. My therapist didn't seem to object to it. I kept drawing the comic strips, practicing talking back to Katrina, giving Harriet a louder voice, and over time, I felt the balance within me shift. I was feeling just a little bit more confident, and a ray of sunshine was peeking through my perpetual dark clouds. One night I was drawing a scene of Harriet blasting Katrina into space, feeling empowered and a little gleeful. That's not what I look like. An unnaturally high-pitched, childlike voice spoke in a sing-song manner, right beside my left ear. The cold breath tickling my earlobes. I could almost feel the lips brush my ear. The voice was that close. I froze. I didn't dare to turn, to look to my left. My eyes stayed glued to the front. Don't you want to see how I look like? The voice spoke again, this time a coy whisper in my right ear. I wanted to draw on, to ignore it, but my fingers wouldn't move. I steeled myself, bracing for any sudden movements from the thing with the voice. It lightly hopped forward, a flash of white and red, and I looked down, refusing to look at it. I think I'm pretty, don't you think? The childish, piping voice went on. I stared down resolutely, cold beads of sweat forming on my forehead and on the palms of my hands, which had gone icy cold. It swooped forward suddenly, pale face looming directly in front of mine. Look at me. The voice had changed, taking on a hellishly low and broken timbre which bended into the previous falsetto. The duality of the voice was enough to freeze the blood in my veins. Even staring down, I couldn't help but make out the pale skin, blood-red lips, and sharp canine teeth. Cold hands gripped the sides of my head and forced my gaze up. Look at me, it growled again in that same blood-curdling double-pitched voice. For a fraction of a second, I caught sight of it in its full glory. Blackened sockets, dark eyes without eye whites, red hair tied in braids on both sides of its face. The teeth glinted in the gory gash of its mouth. Then the face rapidly warped into that of a little girl's. Pale skin, big black eyes, sallow cheeks, red lips with 2 red circles painted into the center of her cheeks. She looked human now, but no less terrifying. She took a step back and tilted her head. Why did you draw me so ugly? She asked, her voice back to the originally high-pitched and childish tone. I looked at her, unable to speak, to form a sentence in my head. Why? She asked again and her voice hardened. You were mean. You said terrible things. But I only told the truth. I always tell the truth. You're a horrible person, so I told you so. She sounded like she was stating an innocent truth, but I knew she was toying with me, enjoying every minute of her taunts. I refused to respond. Then it popped into my head. Does Harriet exist too? I asked. Why, so she could swoop in and save you? From me? Tiny old me? You little weakling. She giggled, a tinkering mess of bells that sent chills down my spine. She's gone now, dear one. Harriet was here once. She fancied herself your guardian angel, so I cut her into little pieces and mixed her up in your food. You didn't even notice. She continued to giggle, turning away, bending, and covering her mouth. I was losing control. The fear was building up, reaching my limit. I couldn't keep a straight mind. I was panicking and about to just curl up into a ball, shut my eyes, and give up. But I couldn't. I knew that would be the end of me, and I wasn't ready for that. A surge of anger flashed within me. You can't scare me. I trailed off, choked on my words when she turned her head to face me. Next stretched past what was humanly possible. She had turned her head a complete 180 and I stared into her eyes, leveled right above her back. In my blinding fear, I heard myself blurt out, "That's such a cliché horror move. You don't scare me." The rage seethed in her demonic eyes. Her face changed, morphing back to its monstrous nature, her fangs gnashing uncomfortably close to my eyeball. As she lunged at me, face first, body still twisted the other way. Something snapped and I think I lost my mind completely. Staring down the completely blacked out eyes of hers, I bellowed, "Get the fuck out, Katrina." The thing seemed startled and it morphed back to the little girl version of itself. "Get the fuck out." I repeated evenly, steel in my voice. She just stared at me, unreadable. "Get the fuck out. Fuck you, Katrina." I raged and grabbed the scissors at my table, slashing at her. I didn't even realize it when she was gone. I caught a small drop of blood on the floor, though. I wonder if I got her, just a little, or if I'd hurt myself without realizing it. The door opened and my mother stood in the doorway, shock plastered all over her face. "Darling, are you okay? What's happened?" She'd rushed in, then gingerly pried the scissors from my hand. I didn't tell her what happened. She had enough to deal with. I just hugged her really close and began to sob. I remember making up some unconvincing, cock and bull stories about being stressed out and acting out my anger by pretending to slice up my bad thoughts. She seemed to buy it, though, and really quickly. I think she just wanted things to be normal, to be okay. Katrina hangs out with me now, almost every day, but she mostly just sits or squats at the foot of my bed, under the dining table, on the windowsill, under the covers, anywhere from which she could look at me, listen to me. She was almost always on speaking, staring at me with a flat expression on her face. Sometimes she'd whisper insults into my ear when I'm least expecting it, but I didn't really mind it much. Not anymore. She's also been doing it less and less over time. The only time she truly concerns me is when I wake in the middle of the night suffocating to her perched on my chest, staring down at me with her big dark eyes, pale skin piercing even the darkness of the night. But I'll manage.